So welcome to the Podcasting 101 panel at Comic-Con at Home 2021. My name is Amin, and I'm the host of Podcast of Ice and Fire, the longest running podcast dedicated to George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, and while it was running, HBO's Game of Thrones. We've got a nice group of people here to talk about the tips and tricks, how to start a podcast, and how to edit, etc. We got a lot to talk about today, so I'll ask our hosts to introduce themselves and let us know what podcast they're from.
Sure. So I'll start. I'm Nick. I'm involved in two main podcasts. The one is Fanthropological, an explorer. Wow, that's a good start. Exploring the breadth of human fandom, which is now completed. And also the Zeal Archives, which is part audio drama, part discussion podcast, 100% dedicated to covering Chrono Trigger one bit at a time. I've been podcasting since 2015, and in that time I've done I think it's 3 podcasts so far.
My name's Duncan. I also go by Valkrist on the internet, and I'm one of the curators of the Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast, which is actually a spin-off podcast from Amin's podcast, the Podcast of Ice and Fire. So we're all big fans of that podcast and loved A Song of Ice and Fire. And so we decided to make our own podcast, but we also do movie reviews and book reviews and basically anything in geekdom. We love to talk about it. And it's a very international podcast. It's not like others where there might be a set of main hosts. We have hosts all over the world, and basically anyone can come on and use our platform to record. And we've started in 2013, and we're now 600 plus episodes and going strong.
My name is Zach. I am also a curator for the Vassals of Kingsgrave podcast, and I am just generally a huge fan, consumer, and also, I guess, creator of all kinds of content. It is definitely something that just means a lot to me in general. And in terms of podcasting, I've been doing it for about 9 years now.
And I'm Michal. I am also a Vassals of Kingsgrave curator. I'm also the host of the Nice Jewish Fangirls podcast, Level 7 Access podcast, Podcast of Surprise, and have done others in the past. I've started podcasting in 2008 and then came back to it in about 2012, and definitely haven't stopped since.
Awesome, that's great. So I guess we'll start at the start of podcasting. What if somebody is looking to begin podcasting? How can they get started in choosing an idea and finding hosts?
I think as far as it goes for choosing an idea, the most important part is picking something that you can talk about a lot, like ramble on, discuss off the top of your head, no notes, no research, just something that you are immensely interested and passionate about.
I agree. I think it's something you're passionate about, something you have to talk about, but you can't necessarily talk about in real life. Like I found that I was so obsessed with The Song of Ice and Fire, but there was no one to chat with about it or get into the weeds about it. And that's how I found a Podcast of Ice and Fire community. So something you just want to talk about, something you're interested in, something that sparks good discussion, and also maybe something that's new, something that isn't being talked about. You know, I always think try and make a podcast that you would want to listen to, but it's not there, so you have to make it yourself.
Yeah, as Nick says, I think it absolutely has to be something that you're passionate about. It has to be something that you are able to talk a lot about. But I think that's more than just passion. I think it actually has to be, if you're intending to do a podcast for a long time, the actual thing has to be something that is capable of being talked about for a long time. So that can either mean that the thing itself is just a boundlessly interesting topic that can be explored in a dozen different ways forever and ever, or it's something that like gets updated, that changes over time. So of course it gives you reason to talk about it again and again. I've seen a lot of podcasts that I think like may set out to either reread a specific book, look at a particular game, something like that, and they'll often sputter once that project is finished because they don't have a sense of where to go next. And sometimes the next step is organic, but it can often be difficult to know where to go. And I think that's just something to keep in mind when you're starting out, like where do we go from here if it's something that feels finite to you. And also, I think I just would agree with what Duncan said about often like podcasting can just be a great outlet to find people or to find people that are just willing to talk about the things that just people in your life aren't as interested in. And I think that's a great place to start for sure.
Yep, I would agree with everyone above. And yeah, just you have to do something you're passionate about. You can always tell, in my opinion, when someone's talking about something that they don't really care about on a podcast, because the medium does not let you hide a lot of stuff. Your face, but not a lot else.
Well, that's when we started the podcast of Ice and Fire. We were just waiting for George's next book. So as it's known, George R. R. Martin takes a long time between books, so that was something we wanted to talk about it. And I was chuckling about what you said, Zach, about like having a topic that actually has legs. Because I almost started a Frasier podcast once, but then we didn't really get anywhere because it's like, how many episodes are we going to do on this show? So.
Yeah.
Did you come up with a title for the Frasier podcast?
No, we recorded the first episode and we're like, okay, how we'll have a lot of legs here. We can only do a couple episodes. Unless we're going to do maybe episode reviews. I suppose that's one kind of general form of podcast, is just watching an episode and talking about it. So we could have done that, but we weren't really interested in doing that.
Just to touch on it briefly,
Sure.
I think there is something to be said about short podcasts. Like, there's not, a podcast does not have to go on forever. There's no shame in like having something go cover, like do a read of the book, and then that's it. It doesn't have to be like 600 episodes is fantastic, but it does not have to go on that long if you don't have that much content.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, if you have an idea and you want to develop it, it could just be 6 episodes or something, or even less. So I guess the point is, though, if you want to do long-term podcasts, then you go with the legs route. But you could do a series of short ones. But what would you? That's a good question, actually. If somebody is starting off, do you think they would be better start with a shorter podcast, or go with a long one, or just whatever they're passionate about?
Oh, that's a hard question. I think that you just have to go with what you're passionate about, because honestly, if you're starting a podcast for the first time, you probably don't know what you're doing. And I don't mean that to belittle anyone. It's just there's so much learning that goes into it that you are going to make some sort of mistake and regret making some choice. And so just start a podcast about what you're passionate about now, and you can always improve it or change it later or start a new one.
Yeah, I think that in a lot of cases, it's a good truth that you're going to discover a lot about what you're doing and how you want to do it as you do it. Like, that's just how it's going to go. When you're starting out, it's going to be simply, I want to talk about this one thing. And from there, I think it will all come and make sense as you do it.
And I think, speaking for myself, like, VOK was a labor of love, and that's why it's gone on for so long. And I think, when I first began, there is a lot to learn about how to host a podcast, how to edit it, how to structure it, how to pitch it, all those kinds of things. You just learn along the way. But as long as you're having fun, I guess, I think that it becomes easy, and you just do it. You just keep coming back to it because you enjoy it. So it's kind of like, I definitely think it's worth having ambitious or like really focused projects that you has a finite finish point. But it might be worth, when you're just starting, just try it out, just have fun with it, just talk with friends. And then once you develop those skills, maybe do something more ambitious.
Now, there's some podcasts out there where it's just one person alone talking about something, but it seems like most of them at least have one other person, or that's an easier way to start with. How do you record? Do you record in person, or do you record online with your other hosts?
As far as I've done, everything's been online. I would love to be in a position where I could have people come visit me and just record in one space. It would make editing so much easier in many ways. But all of my podcasting experience has been online, which has its own problems. You have to like shuttle files across the internet. You have to deal with people's different recording environments. But it does, at least once you've got that done once, it's consistent for every other time.
Yeah, I've almost always recorded a podcast online, and that's by necessity because all of my co-hosts live in different countries. And a big challenge of that has been figuring out time zones. So World Time Buddy has been a big savior in terms of scheduling it. Scheduling alone is a bit of a project. The few exceptions have been when we've actually had meetups. Some of us, as we're traveling around the world back in pre-COVID times, have actually met up and recorded podcasts and recorded panels at places like Con of Thrones and Worldcon and Ice and Fire Con and things like that. But yeah, other than that, all online. And that really benefits, I think, kind of amateur productions because everyone has a computer, everyone can afford earphones and a microphone, so it really democratizes the process. You don't have to have a studio. Anyone can do it. And that's exciting, I think.
Yeah, I think the idea of record in person in a studio and all that stuff, it's very aspirational, right? It's kind of like what you would picture you're doing when you're starting a podcast, but it's definitely not necessary to make a good product, I think. And there is some initial work, like Nick says, to figure out how to handle it online, and there's a lot of variables you have to work with. But once you do have that in place, like you say, it's really not so bad. And in some ways, I think it's easier to get that set up. And of course, it just creates a lot less issues of actually getting people in a room in one place, which is often challenging.
Yeah, I've recorded only occasionally with some of my co-hosts on one of my podcasts, and I will say that the chemistry in that case is particularly fun, and it definitely does make editing easier because you're not dealing with tracks, or you're not dealing with my mic sounded bad, or you're all in the same boat together, and there's body energy that you can just read off of and work from. But that said, I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of freedom and opportunity in being able to record online. Like, I don't think that we should view that as a second best. Like, I've never recorded a podcast in a studio. Like, that's cool, I guess, but like, whatever. The idea, like, instead of that, I was once on a podcast that some of you guys were on, where we were talking to people. I'm in New York. People were in California, Australia, Pakistan. People were in Britain. Like, we were literally all over the world and talking about the same thing together, all over the United States. And there aren't, it's a very freeing thing, especially if you're looking for, diversity and a variety of viewpoints. Like, you aren't stuck with the people or the people who can get to your studio. Pretty much everyone has either a Skype account or a Zoom account or whatever. And taking advantage of that, I think, is one of the things that especially amateur podcasts do can do really beautifully.
Yeah, and that's a good point about this is an international phenomenon. Like, it's not limited to your location or country. And I should have asked that at the start, I guess. Which countries are you guys from? Where you're located, I guess.
I am from the distant northland of Canada.
I'm from Australia.
U.S.
Also U.S.
Yeah.
Good. So even this panel itself demonstrates that you're not limited to your country there. Is there anyone that joined? Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I do think that's one of the things that's really encouraging about the internet, or exciting about the internet, because there's so much that's horrible about the internet that we've seen in the past 10, 15 years. But that sort of obliteration of distance and that enabling of a melting pot of different people is really, I don't know, I love it. It's like helped me through a lot of tough times.
Also, if you podcast with people in different time zones, you get weirdly familiar with like what time it is in like, I don't know, Australia or whatever. And then it's like, oh crap, they're in Melbourne, but they're in Sydney. Ugh, you guys,
You get those emails when you're scheduling where you have 3 or 4 different time zones in the same email, like this time, that time. Yeah, it'll improve your time understanding. Like,
Google also keeps shutting us out of our account because different people try to keep accessing it from different countries, and it thinks we're being hacked, but it is us.
Amazing.
Google's like, what is this?
Well, we have hosts
syndicate?
from 5 continents, I think. All 5 continents, I think, have been on.
Maybe, yeah. US, Britain, or UK, Europe. I don't think we have Asia or Africa, and not South
I mean,
America.
we have Asia, like.
yeah, we have Asia.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Pakistan. Yeah. But hopefully we'll get the other 2 continents.
Yeah.
Let's get Antarctica in there.
And
Yeah,
Antarctica,
that would be nice.
Set up our own base.
Yeah.
So, is there anyone here that actually joined an existing podcast? I want to see what that experience was like instead of starting your own.
I have not, so I'll have to defer to the many Vassals of Kingsgrave podcasters here.
I've never started a different podcast. We've sort of done podcast series within VOK. So we did like a reread, we did sort of movie podcasts, different kind of themes, read-throughs of different books within the main podcast. I've been a guest host on a few different podcasts. Like, I've done sort of voice work for History of Westeros and Radio Westeros. And I've been on Podcast of Ice and Fire and Vassals of Kingsgrave and a few other places, but no, never never branched off into my own thing yet. But who knows?
Yeah, same for me. A few guest things, but mostly it's been getting on the ground floor with something, so I don't have much experience with that.
Yeah, I was actually invited to join the Level 7 Access podcast because I was blabbing on Twitter about Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and they basically slid into my DMs and were like, hey, want to join a podcast? And I was like, sure.
I actually want to know more about that experience, but I think this might flow into the next question generally is like, how do you build chemistry with co-hosts, and can that be done intentionally? And perhaps when we get to your point, Michal, like when you joined that podcast, was it different joining a group of other people instead of starting with your own group?
I'm kind of curious if we can start with Michal's
Sure.
experience
Yeah, go ahead,
first here.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's definitely, well, first of all, I mean, I do believe that chemistry not only can be built, it has to be built. Like, I don't think that many people actually have instant chemistry, especially when you're recording and it's artificial, so to speak. So I do think it's something you have to foster. You're definitely not going to get it with everyone, but you're not going to get it if you don't work on it. And we're really lucky online because we can chat with people constantly via text. And, you know, like I have threads with people going back a very, very long time at this point. And, you know, that's also building chemistry. It's not just recording. It's all part of the process. How it works when you're coming onto a new podcast, obviously it's going to be, you know, different every time, but like they were very sweet and very excited to have me, and I was happy to be there. Definitely, you know, you feel like the new kid for a bit, like you don't want to, I guess, talk too much or whatever, but some people have that feeling no matter what, you know, in a podcast. I would just say honestly, like, especially if you're invited to something, like they invited you for a reason, like that clearly they like your brain, your tongue, your abilities, and in some, don't do that, Duncan, I saw that. They like your ability to podcast. So, you know, it's not going to get right off the ground. Like they had some particular, we used to watch live episodes while we were recording, and they would use a particular phrase that made no sense to indicate pause, and like they wouldn't use the word pause. They just had an in-joke that developed. So that was something that, you know, I had to like gradually adapt to, and I was often several seconds or more ahead of them because I wouldn't press pause when they did. But yeah, I think anytime you're enjoying something, you'll be able to find the chemistry and the patience and, you know, the reason to be there.
Yeah, kind of extending off of Michal's answer, just talking with people. Like, as an example, before we started this panel, we just talked. Some of us were familiar with each other in different ways, some of us weren't. But the only way to kind of build up any sort of rapport, any sort of chemistry is to talk. That could be through DMs, as in your case, or chatting, or making sure to schedule time separately from podcasting. Or if you're starting a brand new podcast with hosts that you don't know very well, just like recording a podcast knowing that you may never bring it to air, just so that you can talk and see what that experience is like.
Yeah, it's hard to quantify chemistry, but I think it really helps. Like the best icebreaker is chatting to people about something you all love and are all interested in. That helps a lot. It's just an easy way of getting the voices flowing and it's just a really good bonding experience. And yeah, it's just, I don't know, it's just a natural thing. Yeah, I don't really know how to describe it beyond that. You chat with people, you get to know them, you feel close to them. It's weird to do it online because we're, you know, obviously it doesn't feel quite the same as being in person, but yeah, it just kind of happens if you give it a chance.
Yeah, a couple of things I'll say. First, just going back to the idea I mentioned earlier about this is all a process, this is all going to happen, and you're going to learn as you go. I think chemistry happens as you go. And I think it's okay if you start out and it's not going. Like if it feels bad, if it feels like your chemistry isn't there, that's fine. It's going to take a few podcasts probably to find your flow, even if you're friends going into it. and you have built-in chemistry going into it, it's probably going to feel a little different when you're on a podcast and you're trying to like specifically talk about certain things before you really find the way that you talk naturally. But it will happen. So I would say just don't worry about it too much, and it'll come.
I guess in theory, if you do an episode and it ever is really bad, you don't have to release it unless you're doing a live podcast. You have that option, or you can give it a second shot. Yeah, do you want to add on to that, Duncan?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. You can always just do a trial run. Yeah, exactly. Just spitball, talk about different things, plan something out. Yeah.
Yeah, I have at least one episode 0 that has not been released for public consumption and never will be. But it was a very valuable learning experience. And also, it's a good place to step on the brakes. If, if it's like I always encourage people to keep going, especially if they were drawn to stuff for a reason. But sometimes you're like, maybe with, like you, Amin, like there isn't, a lot of Frasier that I can actually podcast about.
It will be if they get that reboot going, maybe.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Frasier reboot where he starts his own
We could have a podcast
podcast.
about whether there should be a Frasier reboot.
I guess the part of the problem with podcasting online is you're right, that artificial nature of it is just, it's not the same as being in person. In person, you can just naturally, even unconsciously, tell when someone's done talking and who's going to talk next. Like, you can just tell that. But when you're using this other medium, it's just difficult. And part of that becomes the weight of the editor. Like, well, the editor is the one that has to prepare the cake. The rest get to eat the cake in the end. But you get better at it over time, I think, and we'll talk about that more when we get to editing. But I guess, like, don't be discouraged if you start out and you're having difficulties. I think we all go through that. There's growing pains. Would you agree?
It is tricky because, yeah, you lose the natural body language etiquette you would in person, especially if you're just recording audio, and also you gain technical problems like lag and things like that, oscillating volumes, things like that. But you figure it out. It's annoying, but you figure it out, and you build etiquette and things like that, and you find your rhythm.
Okay, so let's go on to, you've got your group going, like maybe your co-host, you have your idea, but how do you actually go about recording? I want to ask about a particular episode. Like, how do you plan an episode? Is there any tools that you use? What kind of structure do you use to plan a particular episode?
I'm going to try to keep this short because I do 2 podcasts and they're wildly different. Anthropological was a weekly podcast, and what we would do is while the editing was happening, we would start doing research in a shared Google document, and by about midweek, finalize some topics and some rough discussion points and have some data and other information that we could use to refer to. All of us on the podcast are very different. So whereas I'm very planning oriented, other folks are very ad hoc, very off the cuff, and that works. That creates interesting chemistry. The other podcast, the Zeal Archives, is part audio drama, part discussion. And so months ahead of time, I'll be writing a script for an episode and then sending that out to voice actors and then getting that and editing it ahead of time so that when it comes time to release the episode, it's ready to go. That's like a really concise version. But to answer the question of like how you plan, a lot of it involves collaboration. So Google Docs is extremely helpful. And it entirely depends on your podcast because you just might be a fantastic improviser. And if that's what works, go for it.
Vassals of Kingsgrave is pretty atypical in terms of podcasts. We don't have a set amount of hosts. We don't have a core host group that can devise podcasts. We're essentially a forum that a podcast developed out of. And generally the way that we put together a podcast is someone will have an idea for a podcast and they will pitch it as a call to arms. So they'll say, would anyone be interested in recording a podcast about, I don't know, WandaVision, for example? And then people may express interest or they may not, and the podcast will just never come to fruition. But if people express interest, the next step is, what time would you like to record? What dates work for people? And then there's a bit of finessing with time zones and whatnot. Once you find a date, the host or the main organizer, the person who's pitched the podcast, will put together a Google Doc, a basic outline, and then open it up for other people to add ideas to. And then the recording time may come. We used to use Skype. Now we've transitioned to Discord. But basically, you add your team to Skype, start the call, and you'll have people recording it. So the main host will be recording it. But it's always very good to have other people recording it as well. We used to use MP3 Skype recorder. With Discord, we use OBS, I believe it's called. And there's an inbuilt recorder, Craig, I think his name is. Yeah, Craig. So we use that. So it's always good to have multiple recorders running. Once you've finished your podcast, export it, and then you can edit it and upload it to wherever you need to.
Yeah, from a planning standpoint, of course, scheduling is probably the number one thing, especially the more hosts that you have. And anyone who does anything collaborative, scheduling is really hard. And if you can get into a place where you have a consistent date and time of recording, then that's great. But yeah, that's the thing that you just have to work with as it goes. Of course, people are going to have things come up, especially if this is just something you're starting out doing as a hobby. It's not something that you can always prioritize, but hopefully everyone is doing their best to make it happen. And from a planning standpoint, I always like to have an outline, something that usually you just make up in Google Docs where everyone can see and everyone can add their notes, like what we're doing with this. Just a little look behind the curtain. Like I like to have that sort of collaborative document where everyone can throw in their thoughts, and so that everyone has a sense of what's going to be talked about beforehand. Because I think while it's great if you can go off the cuff, it's great if you are that kind of person who can just improv it and just come up with stuff as you go. I personally benefit a lot from having a sense of where I'm going and what I'd like to talk about. And I think that generally makes me say better things for the most part. But it depends. It depends what your style is, what you feel is best, and what you feel like gets the best words out of your mouth.
Yeah, pretty much what everyone said. I mean, I think it's definitely going to depend both on the style of your podcast and on your personal style. And I think, the point about it being a hobby is an important one. At least for me, there's a limit to how much pre-time I know I can put into an episode, and like a lot of the time that will be like having a chat beforehand with the people I'm doing the podcast with, and we're making up a doc, and like we all jot down ideas, and then maybe later we go back and expand those ideas. Other podcasts, it's literally nothing. We go in knowing we're going to discuss like this episode, and we've all watched the episode, we all have thoughts on the episode, and that's kind of how we go from there. I also did briefly one fully scripted podcast that was so much work. But yeah, I mean, it really depends on how much effort you are willing to put into the thing. I don't know if effort's the right word, because it is effort when you're in the process, but how much pre-work you're willing to do. And that's going to be a personality thing. It really, I don't think is indicative of like the quality of your podcast. Like I guarantee you there are super professional podcasters that sit down and shoot off their mouths and somebody edits it for them and they get to number 5 on iTunes or whatever, the charts. And there are plenty of people who script their podcasts out word by word, and don't have big listener followings, which we'll talk about later, is not also indicative of your success at all. But I think you find your rhythm with these things. You find what you're willing to do, what you're able to do, and what you enjoy doing.
What I like go ahead.
I think it is a real balance, I found at least, between having enough spontaneity and enough planning. So I find you don't want too much of either, because if you have too much planning, it might become rigid. People might become less apt to talk because they feel like or they might find that work too much and not be interested. But if there's too much spontaneity, it might just be chaotic and unenjoyable for the listener. So it's about finding enough structure to have fun and explore ideas.
Just to quickly follow from that idea, it's a skill, I think, to know how to talk off notes and not talk the notes. I think that's actually a thing you have to learn as you go. And it actually is extremely valuable to develop that sense of like having an outline of things that you're going to say, but not just like repeating them out when you're talking.
And develop a sense of flow, I guess. You want a conversation to develop naturally rather than just sort of abruptly moving from one point to the next. So you might have a whole list of notes, but it's got to make sense to the listener how it's going.
Yeah, and off that, just be prepared to let go of things you were planning to say. Like if the conversation goes a different way, just be ready to let go of it. Don't feel like you need to like force it back into the conversation. Sometimes things are just not going to get covered, and that will not be what happens on this podcast.
Yeah, and the planning's never wasted, I think. You might be reading a book or analyzing a movie, but that process of thinking about it and writing notes about it, it's never wasted. It's all getting your brain sort of moving towards something, and then the podcast is where I guess all the ingredients mix together and something comes out of it.
Yeah, one of
If
the...
you want to learn how to, sorry,
Go ahead, sorry.
if you want to learn how to talk from your notes as opposed to just reading notes, listening to history podcasts I find is a pretty good way of getting into that, because good history podcasters, I mean, there are good history podcasters who read from their notes, and their notes are great. But as a general rule, it's more listenable if you sound like someone is just conveying information to you and talking to you about the thing rather than talking at you of the thing. So I find that medium is really delicate in that way, and that there are people who do it really well, and finding their flow and listening to how they discuss things is very, very useful.
Yeah, the advantage of Google Docs, I find, is not everyone has to write in there. You can have one person maybe put an outline, other people put in ideas, and other people might just read it. They might not write anything, but they still get a benefit of seeing what else people are thinking about. So each person can decide in the report how much you want to do there. I'm a fan of using the different color fonts for each person, so you can see who's saying what. And what I like about outlines is it helps you not forget something. They're like you don't have to force the topic to go there, but often you have a good time. You're like, oh, you forget everything you want to cover. But I guess maybe I'll adapt what you said here. Like we don't always have to follow the outline, because an idea came to mind that's not there. We're having this discussion of learning skills here, and like not reading from your notes. That's a skill that's not just useful for podcasting. That's useful in pretty much any professional life or schooling. So is there anything that you've learned from podcasting that has helped you in your own personal and professional life, and vice versa? Is there any skills that you brought from that life to here that may have helped you? Feel free to answer both or one of those questions.
The short answer is definitely, but the longer answer is I'm going to need a minute to think.
Sure.
I mean, it sounds obvious, but I definitely think communication, like being able to articulate an idea, to really think about it, to have the listener in mind about who's going to hear it and how they're going to process the thought. Facilitating discussions, like that's really useful if you're in that kind of work where you're hosting meetings or just talking to people, talking to customers, whatnot. And yeah, the tech side, I think you learn how to edit, you learn how to record, you make a Google Doc, like all that stuff is really useful in general for organizing a project. And analytical skills and persuasive argument skills. That's all really useful, I think, in general life and in work.
Yeah, just to play off something that we talked about previously, scheduling. Scheduling is an enormously useful skill to learn. It's something that when I started podcasting, I didn't have any kind of formal job yet, because that's when I started. It was that long ago. And when I had one, I realized I had this skill in place already to send out all these emails and set up meetings with people all over the world that happened to be whatever thing I was doing. And I just had that already. It was there because of podcasting. And I think there's so many things you learn from it. And I think about it a lot because I'm just the kind of person who is interested in learning stuff. But also, I think with this kind of thing, especially when you're starting out, especially when it's a hobby, you have to think, what am I getting out of this? And there's a ton you get out of it. Even if you're not making money, even if it's not growing immediately, you're learning a ton. And it's going to help you in all things in your life. Like everyone has already said, it's going to make you a better speaker. It's going to make you more capable of just being articulate in your normal life or in any other situation you find yourself in. So that is huge by itself. And there's a ton of other things that you'll gain from it.
Yeah, I think it's also useful in terms of being able to defend your interests. I think, especially if you're in the nerdy sphere, I feel like I'm probably not alone in having people not understand why I care so much about something and why I want to talk about something professionally or write about something. And it really, it becomes helpful when you're immersed in something like that and talking with people who take it equally seriously and care as much as you do and respect the fact that you are there. to convey that to other people. They may not agree, but it as a matter of confidence, I think it is actually really helpful. And yeah, I've definitely, I mean, the idea, the concept of having an idea in your head and being able to articulate that, I think is actually surprisingly difficult, especially, with people using the internet when we can, rewrite and erase and all those kinds of things. And being able to do that verbally is actually quite difficult. And it is not the same as writing down an idea. It's using a different part of your brain, and you're in podcasting able to really exercise that. And yes, you get to learn how to edit audio, which is so much fun.
I love editing. But it does. I also find it really fulfilling, because when I love something, like a book or a series or a movie or a video game, I love it, but I can't articulate it or I can't draw it out. I don't know. I've just found it really fulfilling being able to explore it and discuss it with other people, and it's really enjoyable, and it's a really great social experience, but it also makes the thing itself more enjoyable. You appreciate it with greater depth, I think, figuring out why you love it, and also seeing that love through other people's eyes, I think, makes it all the better.
Adding on to everyone's answers, I think definitely it's a lot of not intrinsic, a lot of intangible skills. It's like the skill of meeting other people and getting to know them better. It's the skill of, I don't even know if it's a skill or if it's a trait, but building communities, feeling more confident. I tend to be more introverted, and so when I podcast with other people, I get to be more extroverted, partly because it's necessary, but also because it helps me to feel more comfortable doing that. And exploring topics that I'm passionate about helps me, like Michal said, to understand myself a little bit better. And I think that's immensely valuable because it's like a reflective skill that isn't always exercised. Also, like many podcasters, it's just a cool opportunity to be creative. If you want to you can do a podcast and it can be just talking heads, or you can say, you know what, this episode we're going to go for broke. It's a completely different concept because it's April Fool's. Nothing matters.
That's an interesting point about building community, because I have found that over the years, Vassals of Kingsgrave has had to sort of, or the curators have had to sort of take on that responsibility, because the podcast grew so big, or the forum or the message boards or the array of hosts grew so big that you did get to a point where there were personality clashes, or there were differences of opinions, or sort of etiquette conflicts, and we did have to think about that, and we did have to think about the kind of culture we wanted to maintain or cultivate. Like, we wanted this sense of openness, we wanted this sense of this balance between being able to express yourself and having the freedom to express yourself, but also being sensitive to other people's opinions and situations and things like that. So, I mean, it depends on what kind of podcast it is, but I'm talking more about the hosts themselves, but also the fandom. If your fandom or your listenership grows big enough, you kind of have to think about what kind of culture do I want to be putting out there and maintaining, I guess. Because it is a community, I think. It does develop. Even though it's online, it's still people.
It is, and just with regards to what you get out of it, I just thought about self-reflection in a way, especially when you listen to a podcast recorded maybe 5 or 10 years ago, and you see how your views on something have changed. It's almost like an archive of what you were thinking at the time. Oh, did I really like that character? Did I really like that show? Whatever back then. So I think that's kind of a benefit there.
It is crazy. It's kind of the only medium in which you can go back and listen to a different version of yourself, because if you do it long enough, you change as a person, and not just your personality, but your voice, your opinions, all those things. So it is, yeah, you're absolutely right. It is an archive.
Also, as a skill, you get very comfortable with hearing your own voice. You will never be the person who says, I hate my own voice, or you will be the person who always says that without fail.
So
my dog's just entered the room, sorry.
Oh, good. How often do you record, and how do you keep active, like an active record schedule?
I think that depends. Like, the obvious answer is that it depends from podcast to podcast. I think that if you're having a podcast that is at least weekly, or bi-weekly, like that's pretty good in terms of your audience. Like people don't forget about you. If they're listening to you, they probably want you to succeed, but it's a lot harder to remember, what happened in the last episode, or what was that podcast I was listening to, when it comes out less frequently than that. Fanthropological was a weekly podcast, and that worked really well both for me and for the audience. Depending on what you're doing, that might not be feasible. Like your podcast could be too much work to get done on whatever cadence. And so how often you record is also a product of that. What can you accomplish as yourself or as the team of people that you have?
Sorry, I missed the question.
We're just saying, how often do you record, and how do you keep active? Just something before you jump in there. I just thought, unless this becomes your job, you don't want it to feel like your job. So there's that balance in the equation as well. You don't want to be like, oh, I have to do another record now. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have a very sporadic recording schedule with Vassals of Kingsgrave. There's kind of a different categories of podcasts. There'll be the one-off podcast that someone will pitch. You want to talk about this movie that's just come out. That's things obviously a bit more time sensitive because you want to talk about it when it's out in cinemas and people will want to hear it and talk about it. We have had series about television shows. So in that case, we'll want to do a review after an episode has come out, and in that sense, it will be like once a week kind of thing. So we did our Game of Thrones podcast and a few other series like Westworld and things like that, Mandalorian. So that was a more structured release schedule. Yeah, it's very strange. Like going back through the OK archives, it will be some weeks we have 3 podcasts come out. Sometimes we'll go 2 weeks without a release. It really, there's no real enforcement of how often we do it. It's really just completely in the hands of the community how often they want to pitch and create a podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say if your goal setting out is to build an audience, I truly believe consistency is essential to making that happen. I think it's really easy if you're trying to get out there, like it's really easy for people to forget about you. There is a lot of content, and if they don't see a new episode in their feed pretty regularly, they're not going to look back for it. And in general, there's just not going to be that kind of snowball rolling down the hill effect where more and more people are seeing it and they're sharing it, and that happens. But at the same time, like if it's a strain for you to make that happen, if it's too much work, I would not worry about it. I think, like, again, the step one here has to be this is something enjoyable that you like doing, and it's not something that feels like work. It feels like constant stress. I think that has to be the starting point before anything else. So if that is what you're looking for, I think that is fine. If you're looking to grow really fast, then you can go for it and do that. And I think you need to if you really want that immediately. But otherwise, just go with the flow. Do when people can. Of course, like it's easy to kind of just like be lazy about it and to not keep it going. Like with content, I think even for yourself, I think you need to get into a routine where it's happening constantly, and you need to hold yourself accountable and hold the other people accountable, and they need to hold you accountable. So it's that mix. But I think it's another one of those things where you're going to figure out what feels best to you as you do it.
Yeah, the only thing I really have to add to this is, as someone who's not great at scheduling things, is, when you're making your podcast, one of the things you decide is, am I working for my podcast or is my podcast working for me? And, what percentage of that, is your personal balance. And I think Zach is totally right in that, like, for professionalism's sake, like if that's really what you're going for, then pick a date, stick to it, have that podcast out, when people expect it, and grow to expect it to be out. Isn't that great? You can foster habits in other people. But yeah, if that's not it, that's not it.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, I definitely don't. You never want it to be a chore, I guess. You never want to be doing it out of obligation because you feel like you have to, or you feel like you need to be releasing a certain number of Patreon episodes to make revenue. It really does have to be a labor of love because there's not a lot of money in podcasting.
Unless it actually becomes your
for the joy
employment,
of
I
it.
suppose. I guess we can. Does anyone here use that as their source of income? or is that still, it really is a labor of love? Because I guess that's what you could have, that could be your goal eventually if that wants to be what you want to do. But I think you need to be realistic at the same time too, depending on like how you start off, like, because you'll be disappointed. Yeah, and if it comes to revenue, like, do any of you get any revenue? Like, what kind of stream would that come from if you do?
I am part of the majority of podcasters whose podcast earns negative income. I've tried a couple of different things, but I'm a bit more curious to hear if other people have had more
But
success.
there's a good point there. If you viewed this as a job or as business, you'd be losing money given the amount of hours you put in. But if it's your enjoyment, then you don't count it that way. But yeah, I think
No,
I mean,
yeah.
VOK is getting some revenue though, right? It's with indirect.
Yeah. I mean, I've never measured it that way. I've always measured it as a hobby and as something I enjoy and that I get, fulfillment out of. We do
Oh, no,
monetize.
let's try and split up our revenue about, what, 740?
Yeah, I was going to say that.
I know.
So,
I
yeah,
know.
it's a
We
special
do,
case. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry, I was just going to say we do, the only source of revenue we have is we monetize YouTube videos. So we release all of the podcasts we release on iTunes. We create a video version of it for YouTube and they do have ads on them. So we get a trickle of money from that, but it's pretty minimal.
You can use that
But we
to pay
use
for
it
the cost of hosting and so forth anyways, right? So.
Yeah, exactly. We use it to cover like website costs and a few other expenses every now and then. But yeah, we haven't really touched it much. It's
Yeah,
there for a rainy day, basically.
Right. And as Michal says, it's not really realistic in that case of what VOK is, which is, again, very unique where it has a lot of hosts to actually, like, imagine how you would possibly split money on that. It all goes back into the podcast. That's the only thing that could possibly make sense for that format. But, in most cases, obviously, that's not going to be what you have. You probably have 2 or 3 hosts that you're dealing with. And if you do get to a point where you can make some money off it, I think that's definitely like a conversation to have about like how that works because, some people are going to be putting more effort into a podcast than others. And you're going to have to hash out like who gets what because of that, because some people are going to be doing a lot of the lifting with editing and hosting it and promoting it and all the different jobs that go into it. So again, I don't think this is something to worry about out of the gate, but if you get to that point, it's definitely, you have to think about how you're going to handle that.
I've listened to a few podcasts that are long running that have created like Patreon episodes and do advertise. These are really well-established podcasts, but at best they seem to describe them as a supplementary source of income. So they make a bit of it, covers the cost of podcasting, gives them a bit of extra money, but it seems like only the really big podcasters can do it as a full-time job.
Yeah, I think it's that difference between, are you looking at it as a source of income or if you get some money to recuperate your costs, all the better, right? I think if you stay at it and you're passionate about it, so you may eventually get enough listeners to even just get revenue from, as you said, like from advertising, from if you put your podcast on YouTube or maybe an affiliate link or something like that.
That underwear isn't going to sell itself.
Yeah.
Or mattresses.
Someone doesn't have Squarespace yet. Someone doesn't know about that service. We're going to let them know.
We're talking a bit about monetization, I guess. But so, has any of you ever been asked to do any ads? Has anyone like contact you to do an ad on your podcast before? Because that happened with Podcast Advice for quite a bit because we'd be so long running and we have a lot of people. But we personally decided no, we're not interested in that because we're not doing it for income. But we did get opportunities for kind of like sponsorship for the people that listen. Like for example, like if we mention somebody and then we get free T-shirts or whatever for the hosts for the listeners. I mean, like for contests for the listeners. So we decided, well, we might do something that if it's Ice and Fire related, then yeah, we'll promote it and give out free stuff. But we're not really interested in earning it. I mean, that's just a personal peeve. I mean, I like my podcast to be like what I would like to listen to. And I just personally, and this is personal, I don't like when I always hear like advertisements or like buy this thing. I understand it. I totally understand it. And especially if it is your source of income, well, you need to do that. But I don't like listening to it myself personally, so then I don't like to put it in my own podcast. Okay,
yeah,
so
I mean, I don't mind hearing it in other podcasts, like because obviously they've given me hundreds of hours of entertainment. I tend to skip it. I don't know how we, like, obviously VOK has never been offered an advertising deal. I don't know whether we would take it or not. We'd have to have a conversation. But I feel like, one, it would be extra work that wouldn't be particularly novel. And two, I don't know, it would feel a bit weird because we're such a, I don't know, we're just a community podcast. It would just feel a bit odd, but who knows?
Yeah, I'll say no one likes listening to ads. No one enjoys doing that. But I think in most cases, especially with a smaller kind of niche community, if that's what you're building, if you get that opportunity, I think they will support you. Your audience will support you in doing that because they want to see you succeed. So if that's the route that you have an opportunity to go, I think don't be afraid to pursue that. I think that in most cases, there may be a few people who are like, no, I refuse to listen to any podcast with ads. But I think in most cases, most people will be willing to accept that.
And as someone who does not have a Patreon account, I can tell you that probably the easiest perk to offer people is ad-free episodes. So
you've got your podcast running, you've got your co-hosts, you're hopefully recording pretty regularly. Like, how do you handle getting guests on the podcast? Like, have you had guests on? Is there any tips or tricks when you have them on there, and just like, how do you handle guests?
The most interesting thing that I find about guests is that when I've done this panel elsewhere, people are like, how do I get guests? And the answer is you ask them. And I mean that in quite possibly the stupidest way. There is a surprisingly large number of people who would be glad to take an hour or 2 hours of their time to answer questions about a thing that they absolutely love or work on, or both. And it turns out that in a lot of cases, you just need to ask them. Now, this doesn't always work. And if you're trying to, I do not know any of the cast of Game of Thrones off the top of my head, but I imagine if you try to ask them, they'll say no, and that's understandable. But there are lots of people that are adjacent to the creations of things that you know and love, and you might be able to get a hold of them. There are tons of people that run other podcasts that you can reach out to or write blogs or whatnot. And so if the question is, how do I get guests? You just need to find a way to reach out and ask them. And maybe you have to ask a lot of different people. But in the, I don't know, more than 50 guests that we had on Anthropological, I was surprised how easy it was to get people who I thought were really cool to talk with me about things. Or when I was at conventions where it's like, hello, famous voice actor, I am a nobody. Could I talk to you? And they are just like, yes. Just ask is the extremely short version.
VOK has never really gone looking for guests. Like, we haven't had famous people on. Usually we encourage listeners to join as guests. So we'll say, if you're interested in joining us for a podcast, let us know. Let us know in the comments. Come along to the forums or the Discord page and just, if you see a podcast, say, I'm interested in joining. So that's kind of built into the brand that we want more people to join. Or to express interest in joining, at least. So we're very much a guest-focused podcast. And that's how the podcast has grown, through guests. Like, again, we don't have set hosts. It's anyone who wants to join a podcast can be on. The priority is the podcast space, and anyone who's interested can join. And it's been a kind of a rotating roster of people across the years. Like, the people who started the podcast, a lot of them aren't here anymore, but new people have come in and replaced them.
Yeah, I personally don't have much experience with, asking guests on and things like that. And I think for my part, I think what Nick says is absolutely right. I think that you just got to ask and see what happens. Like, what is the worst that can happen? It's of course scary at first, but it's the same general rule as anything else. Like, just got to ask, see what happens. In terms of the question of like why or when you should have guests on, I think for me, it's something that you don't necessarily need to force. Of course, it depends on the format. If you're doing an interview podcast, you need guests. That's the whole thing, right? So that is going to have to be step one of what you're doing. But otherwise, I think like it's probably going to feel right at some point if like there's just someone who is similarly interested in the topic, or someone you've met or connected to through whatever means, whether that's meeting them at a con, or it's like, oh, this seems like a good person, a good fit to have on. And then you can do that and you can ask and see where it goes. Otherwise, like, I actually do think that from a promotional standpoint, if you do have a connection, someone you've met, someone that can come on that is known, that can, with whatever media power they have, social media power they have, whatever it is, that can signal boost your podcast, that can be valuable if you have that opportunity. And also, if you have the chance, if they have some kind of podcast or other outlet that you could come on, that makes sense. That is also really great. and it's a way of returning the favor in some sense if it makes sense for you to be on their thing. And I think that is a valuable way of just kind of building this sense of you people are working on the same kind of thing together, and then their listeners might be keen to come check out what you're doing, that kind of thing. And there's a lot of opportunities, I think, there. But it's, again, like it's kind of go with the flow, in my opinion, of when that sort of thing makes sense.
So there's a funny thing about podcasting that at least I find, which is that you will not think this when you are recording your podcast, but after a certain amount of time, if people are listening to you, they want to listen to you. And so while they definitely probably do want to hear the lead actor of the show you're talking about or the author of the book that you're discussing, that's in the context of what you're bringing to it. So it's not necessarily about, like, it's super cool to have super cool guests on your podcast. Like it really is. But it's not as necessary, I don't think, for your ultimate success as you might initially think. You can definitely do this, either with, as Nick said, really good tip, like lower profile people who put in just as much, if not more work than, the people in front of the screen or whatever. And fellow fans, it's because it's what you are, it's how you're orchestrating the thing that is ultimately the reason why people listen.
And just to build on that, I guess, it's just I want to mention is I actually use a podcast resume to keep track of past guests that we've had or past things that we've reviewed, and you can build that over time. So when you actually go to somebody who's more famous or get something to review, you can show them, this is what I've done before. There's actually something they can look at, and you can see your record. But yeah, Duncan, you wanted to add on to that?
Well, I do find that guests on podcasts are some of the best interviews because you actually have time to go deep into a topic. Like guests on a TV show or a radio station, they'll be 30 seconds to 5 minutes. It's really just like sound bites. But if you can spend time getting to know someone, letting them get comfortable and just having a human conversation, it's often far more fascinating and you get a much better insight into who they are as a person. And I also think podcasting is, as Michal says, a great way to meet less famous people who are still in the industry, people who aren't necessarily on radio, on television. And they often have really interesting things to say because they haven't necessarily done an interview and they don't have stock answers to give. They can just talk about their work. So I love listening to people on podcasts because it can get quite deep and fascinating. And it really does, I mean, more than any other medium, I think podcast feels like you get to know someone because it's such an intimate experience hearing someone talk to you, being essentially like virtually in their living room or in their study as they chat.
So up to now, we've kind of been taking the more theoretical approach to podcasting generally and kind of organizational, but I want to get into the more the nut and bolts here with recording and editing. Let's start off with recording. What kind of hardware to use? What kind of software to use for recording?
This is like a weird question because I think it's like guests and people put a lot of emphasis on it. I'm firmly of the opinion that there's like a threshold that all podcasts probably sound good enough, and getting to good enough does not require a lot of equipment. For the longest time, I recorded my podcast on like a Blue Snowball microphone, which is more expensive now, but typically is very affordable. It has a bunch of different settings that you can do for like directional or for like in a group setting. And like, that's good enough. You can get really fancy. I right now have like, it doesn't even matter. It's a fancy microphone and a mixer hooked into the computer, but it doesn't matter because you can make a really good sounding podcast. Potentially, I don't recommend this with like AirPods or like a headset mic or something, but you can do that. Like you can do it with like lots of off-the-shelf stuff that you have. I don't think the hardware matters that much, especially if you're doing something online where at the end of the day, you're going to have to splice it all together and edit it and tweak each of the individual tracks anyway.
Yeah, I find there's no logic to the correlation between how expensive a microphone is and how good it is, because I bought really expensive microphones and they sound terrible, and really cheap ones and they sound crystal clear. So I tend to have like 3 microphones. I've got this headset, which is useful for like moving around. I've got a stationary mic, which is probably better quality, but I find it's a bit restrictive because I can't move away from it as much. So I tend to use those 2. In terms of software, we initially used Skype, which was, it's not great, but it does the job, an MP3 Skype recorder to record conversations. And we're using Discord, which has inbuilt recording, and OSB Studio. And in terms of editing software, Audacity is the go-to because it's free and it's pretty good. I use a program called Adobe Audition, which I find just has more options. It's just a bit easy to use, but you do have to pay for that.
Before we go on to Zach, Nick, can you just tell us some of those mics you put up?
Okay.
Like, what are they?
Yeah, sure. So these are all XLR mics. If you want to know what an XLR mic is, the short version is it has these 3 pins at the bottom. But like this is just a dynamic microphone that's really good for like live applications. It's directional, so mostly like stuff at the end, not so much at the sides. This is an omnidirectional microphone that I use for interviews sometimes. It picks up sound all around it. And this is a condenser microphone, which is really good at being super sensitive. So it picks up lots of different noise, which is great in a very sound dampened environment, but not for my noisy hardwood covered floor home. But like you can get lots of different varieties of these styles of microphones, but fundamentally you can just get, like, most USB microphones will give you really good quality audio, or you can tweak it in. I hesitate to say tweak it in post because that is a path to ruin, but you can make things sound pretty good.
Would you say you would at least need a headset or a pair of headphones so you can prevent echoes? Like, that's the minimal requirement?
Yeah. Also, to add on to the Audition, like which software to use, there's some other software that you can use. Like Audition is a very expensive monthly fee that I'm also paying. You can also get something like Reaper, which is a one-time cost and is very similar to a lot of professional tools, but doesn't necessarily have a huge learning curve.
Another pro tip, record in an enclosed, quiet space. Don't record outside. Don't record where there's people around, because the background noise, even if you can't hear it at the time, the editor will hear it and they will go insane.
That they will. Yeah, I mostly echo a lot of what you guys have said. Like Duncan said, I personally never found a correlation of quality mic with cost. Like, some of the best mics that just kind of get the job done are the cheaper ones. I've used a lot of the ones that Nick mentioned, like the blue Snowball, Blue Yeti. Like those are great. Like, I got the cool mic arm now. There it is. It's cool and fun. But it's really not needed. Like, I think, like Nick said at the start, like, if you go into it thinking like, all right, once I buy the $500 mixer and the cool mic and set it all up, I am a podcaster. Like, that is not necessary. And
I have arrived.
Yeah, and it's not the main thing that's going to determine your success, or just the quality even. So it's not really that big a deal.
Yes, as everyone has said. I mean, I personally believe that audio quality is one of the least important parts of a podcast, but I think that's maybe a controversial opinion, and I understand people are audiophiles and like things to sound pretty, but to me it's really, obviously you want, like Nick said, to hit a certain threshold, but after that, like, it's about what you're talking about, not how you sound while talking about it. And frankly, I listen to some really bad sounding podcasts that I have found wonderful and fascinating.
It's like digital cameras right now. Like, at a certain point, you need that many megapixels. Like, once you have enough to get you over the threshold, you need all those other rest. Maybe in some circumstances, like if you're going to be singing on your podcast or something. But Nick,
or like radio dramas and whatnot. Yeah.
The only thing I was going to add to that is, if everything sounds bad, that's fine. The only problem is if you are doing a podcast with 3 people and 2 people sound terrible and 1 person sounds good. You have to make that 1 person sound terrible, or those other 2 people sound fantastic.
they've got to go. They're out.
Yeah, just drop them.
That one person, just it's not worth it.
Yeah, just the other thing I'll say is that don't podcast with any kind of built-in mic on your earbuds, because they will pick up everything, and yeah, you'll just be like through your podcast. It took me an embarrassingly long time to realize that.
Unless
switch
it's
to these extremely cheap headphones.
Unless it's an ASMR podcast, then different rules.
Then that's the function of it. But I guess as we roll into editing, and the point Michal made is think of the editor. Whenever you're doing something, don't be like, oh, they can just be edited out. Like, well, sometimes it
Won't
can
somebody
be.
please think of this?
I like to call it in my own experience, the 3-to-1 rule, which is for every hour of content or you record, it takes at least 3 hours to edit, sometimes more. So that's why I don't do 3-hour podcasts anymore, because I don't edit for 9 hours. But like, we talk about generally tips on editing, and as well, like if you are an editor yourself, what would you wish the host or guests would know when they're recording the episode?
Oh God, I feel like you could do an entire episode on just this, and I'm like, you can. It's an audio engineering is a field. In a perfect example of not practicing what I preach, a good tip for folks who are editing and recording, like both parts of that equation, make sure to like when you're recording, think about what you say before you say it. And by that, I mean giving your mind a moment to pause and enunciate words properly. As an editor, there's nothing worse when somebody talks really fast and they're going like this, and then you have to edit out a single word, but you can't find a break between the words because they keep going as fast as they can, as an example. But there's so many different editing tips. As an editor, the biggest tip that I have is, if you can, listen to the podcast at like 2 times speed or 1.5 or something faster than normal speed. You will probably still pick up on most of the problems with whatever you're editing, and you'll be able to edit it faster. But in terms of other tips of like recording, the biggest one that I have for recording is to try to dampen your environment. If you've got hardwood floors, like lay down a blanket on the floor, or like cover yourself in a blanket, drape it over your monitor or something like that. But honestly, there's so many tips, and I'm sure when somebody else adds something, I'll be like, ah, yes, and also this.
Yeah, I'm weird. I know most people hate editing. I actually quite like it, or I find it quite a meditative experience, and also quite satisfying to actually take a raw piece of audio and then just like smooth it down to something really sort of light and listenable and interesting, cutting out all the things you wish you hadn't said in the podcast, all the ums and the ers and whatnot. You can be a bit obsessive, like you don't want to be cutting out every tiny little grammatical misstep. Just kind of, you want it to flow nicely. You don't want it to be juddering like little cuts. You want to be able to have natural pauses and natural time to think and process. It's okay for someone to say or or stumble over their words. I tend to just cut more like tangential stuff. If someone sort of goes off course, goes off on something that really goes nowhere, tangents, jokes, that kind of things, I cut that out just so it's nice and focused. Some of that content might be quite entertaining, but it's just not relevant to the conversation. So if it's worth keeping, you can just chuck it in the after show. It's just a little Easter egg for the listener. As I said, to help the editor, record in a quiet space, have a good microphone setup. Don't be talking directly to the computer or you get echo. At least have some earphones in if you're using the computer microphone. That's about it. One fascinating thing I find with editing is that you can actually see the shape of sound as you're going through it, and you can actually see distinctions between people. You can look at the shape of a audio wave and tell, oh, that's Michal speaking, that's Zach speaking, that's Nicholas speaking, because they look different. And you can almost get to a point where you can cut things, particular phrases or words or ums, by looking at it. So I tend to just, when I'm editing, I'll just play it normal speed, just go through it, cut it. Some are easier than others. Some conversations just flow better and there's less mistakes. Some are a bit more disjointed if the chemistry is not as good. But again, it's just practice. You get quicker the more you do it, and eventually it's second nature.
I don't think I maybe enjoy editing as much as Duncan does. It's definitely a trial, especially with those really long podcasts like you mentioned, Amin. But at the same time, I think editing is an opportunity to sort of flex your creativity. Going back to something Nick was talking about earlier, like this is a good chance to really have that creative moment where you're kind of responsible for shaping the conversation, what it's going to look like, and it feels really good to like bring a good product out of the editor. And have something that like just sounds good to your ear. And like maybe that's just you cutting out the different tangents in the conversation. Maybe that's you like adding post effects, like maybe you have like music or other things that add to it. And like having that full complete product and getting to listen to it, that's really gratifying. And it's really fun to learn how to do that better and better. And I'll say like when you're starting out, like there's going to be a lot of tools in any of these, like even if it's Audacity, one of the more simplistic ones, there's going to be a lot of things at your disposal to use. And I would say like, don't worry about that so much. Like the actual like moment to moment process is really intuitive of just like cutting out the things, making everything just fit in the right way. Like it just makes sense because like Duncan says, you're looking at audio waves. You can see like how like where the like spikes are, where the dead air is. And the last thing I'll say, like, on that dead air point is, like, I generally believe, and I think this is, like, slightly uncommon maybe, is, like, don't be so afraid of dead air. Like, don't be afraid of the idea that, like, there is 3 seconds of silence in your podcast at any moment, and they all have to be systematically removed because that's how conversations work. Like, there are moments where people pause to think, and I think that's something that, like, I think should be encouraged in your hosts. Like, when you're starting out, say, like, don't be afraid yourselves to take a moment because either I as the editor will choose to cut that or I'll use it to like give the podcast a certain feeling to it, right? There might be a specific kind of podcast where you want it to be really fast and energetic and really like just like snappy and all that. Or you want it to be slow and kind of thoughtful. Maybe you're like going for some NPR energy or something like, or it's just like really slow and methodical and it sounds really serious. Like whatever kind of like method you're going for, like that's your opportunity. That's your oyster as the editor to figure out and to find the best way to make it sound.
Just to build on that silence point, is there a line from Pulp Fiction, or it's like you found a nice partner when you can be silent for a long time, not have any problem?
Silences.
And it's contrary to what you expect for a podcast. You think, oh, we need to be filling this time. No. If you have nothing to say, be silent and think, because it's very easy for the editor to remove silence. It can be done in one step, whereas removing ums and extra uhs while you're trying to think, just be silent if you can. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking that extra couple of seconds to think about what you're going to say means you're actually going to say something more organized and articulate, which ultimately helps the editor.
Helps in your own personal life and your professional life as well. Like if you actually start using that same method for talking generally, it helps you.
Quickly, something that both Michal touched on and Zach did and Amin did as well. You know, there's the 2-to-1 rule, which is it takes twice as long to edit as it did to record. And
you're optimistic with the 2-1, I think.
Yeah, no, I know. It's sorry. It's somewhere between 2 and 4, depending on how. Yeah. But as Michal was mentioning about that other podcast where they had a secret phrase for pause, a time check is extremely useful because you could be having a fantastic conversation, but if you are talking for 3 hours, then that is somewhere between 6 and many more hours I cannot do 4 times at the moment. But it's a lot of time. And so you can definitely just be in the middle of a podcast and do whatever you need to do for a time check and then decide, like, maybe we'll come back and record a second episode, or maybe this is good for now. Or maybe we'll finish this conversation because we're almost done.
Yeah, and that's kind of the host or the moderator's job to keep things rolling at a reasonable pace. And often, at least we found with VOK, the editor will often be the host. So they kind of have a vested interest in keeping things, to a reasonable or manageable level. Although sometimes the conversation is so good that it just blows out to 3 hours and whatever. I will say the 3-to-1 rule usually applies, except in the case of radio dramas, or we often record these things called full cast recordings or full castle recordings, we call them, where we read a chapter from a book, usually A Song of Ice and Fire, where each host takes a character, and it's like a radio drama, and then afterwards we add music and sound effects and turn it into a whole production. Those are the ultimate editing challenge.
12-to-1.
They can tell, if you're lucky, they'll take all day, they'll take days to get done. It's amazing when you listen to it, it's so satisfying, but those are a real challenge. And just sourcing all the sound effects and music is a huge challenge.
Speaking of ratios, way more of those get recorded than get released.
I know, yeah.
Well, it almost becomes like a video cast. I mean, that's why I like to do podcasts with audio, because when you get a video or you put lots of effects, it just becomes more and more of an editing process.
We do have many podcasts that were recorded but have just fallen into limbo, or we call it the darkling plane. All of these things that have been recorded but are just floating out there. They're sitting on someone's desktop. They haven't had time to edit it because of it wasn't what they wanted, or it was too long, or the audio was lost or whatnot.
Well, that's interesting, Duncan, because I thought darkling plane is when your recording failed and you don't even have it at all. Like that one, there's still hope to get it potentially. Someone will, or is an expansive term maybe.
I usually equate it with either recording failed, or just it's you remember recording it, but you don't. It was never released. That you don't know who has it, and who has it is no longer active on the podcast, and it's just floating out there in the darkling plane.
I don't want to belabor the point, but I do think it's worth calling out explicitly, and this was touched on previously. Another important recording tip is to always have more than one recording. Record yourself.
Yes.
Record if you're doing
the most important
online.
Rule, actually, the fundamental multiple recorders, because there's nothing worse than having a great conversation and then you have nothing. It's all gone, and then the second time you do, it's not going to be the same. Like, or the third time.
Yeah, if you record yourself and you don't have that and you have a group call, it's like, sure, the call quality might be bad, but at least you have something. And you can just have a note at the beginning of the podcast, sorry, we lost this version of the recording. But if you don't have any backup, just sorry, no podcast.
Yeah, what's the rule of redundancy? Like 3 is 2, 2 is 1, and 1 is none.
That sounds right.
I think in Star Trek they always have a secondary backup. I think that's a good approach for recording. But it kind of, just to build on that, because we're talking about you don't want to lose the golden moment. That's kind of my philosophy with editing in general. Is you need to have that connection with the host where they know it's kind of like a safe space. If they, after the recording, they tell you, oh, I really messed up, I really want to cut this, you'll do that. And if they know that, then they will loosen up, and it'll truly become like that conversation you have with your friends. Because when you talk with your friends or family, you say whatever you want. Like you release your inner filters, and you give that 125% that you don't do elsewhere. And then my job as editor is to bring it down to 100%. I get it to that 100%. But if you don't have that relationship, or you don't know there's going to be editing, you will self-censor and you'll bring yourself down to 90 or 80%. So you won't get to your 100% potential if you don't have that relationship with the editor and know that's going to be edited. So that's my philosophy for editing in general. I feel like that's the best way to do it. Okay, so I guess that's it for editing. So I guess we'll get to the last bit of the podcast. So we talked about planning the podcast and recording and editing, but what about actually getting it out there? I want to ask you about how do you release your podcast, and what mediums, and like what kind of websites or promotions you do. We'll just kind of do it as a general question for those various topics.
I will start by saying, in terms of like getting the podcast out there, I'm sure I'm not the only person, but I am definitely amongst the people that are like, oh yeah, I made a podcast, so it happened. Which is, if you are building a podcast and your intent is to grow an audience, that is not going to succeed. Posting something once is like the immediate point made about redundancy. No one saw it. It didn't happen. So you have to post regularly. But in terms of what I do post, our podcast as a website is provided by our podcast host, which is Podient. There are lots of podcast hosts that give you a website as well. So I'm not going to dig into that too much. In terms of social media, I usually have we have like a cover art that goes out for each episode, and that usually comes out before the episode to give it like a sneak peek or like a quote. Talking about the Zeal Archives specifically, there'll be like an out of context quote from the episode. And then later, when the episode's been edited, there'll be like little snippets from it without giving things away, or like a blooper reel or something like that. So like there's lots of different things you can use to promote your podcast that aren't just, here's my podcast, listen to my podcast. But you also have to do that work.
I feel like we're not that good at promoting our podcast, or I feel
you put it on YouTube though. I mean, even putting on a different medium, like I assume you're all in iTunes at least, right? We're all on iTunes.
I feel like the main listeners of the podcast feed are each other, or the main people who comment on it are each other. technically, if you go to our RSS feed, we have like 1,500 subscribers. We usually get 500 to 1,000 listeners, which is decent. We have much bigger subscriber base on YouTube. So YouTube, like an established sort of social media distribution model, seems to be more effective, especially for something like A Song of Ice and Fire, where there's just people frothing at the mouth to consume content. So I think we have maybe 9 to 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. So we get a decent amount of people from that. In terms of like the technicalities of how we actually get it onto iTunes, it's funny because the person who set up all that stuff is no longer active. So I feel like we couldn't actually replicate it if we wanted to, but it does somehow work. But I think it's something like we post it to WordPress. WordPress connects to FeedBurner, I think it's called, and then FeedBurner connects to iTunes and all the other podcatcher things. We've got a few social media accounts. It'll post to Facebook automatically. It'll post to Twitter automatically. One person runs our Instagram. Another person runs a TikTok, things like that. So we all kind of chip in and promote it in different ways. And that's kind of the benefit of having so many people in the community. Everyone can kind of spruik it to their particular group.
Yeah, I'll just say the number one hardest thing in this whole thing is getting people to see your podcast. Like, this is incredibly hard. It's a lot of luck is involved. A lot of uncertainty is involved. A lot of these places where podcasts are hosted, like the Spotify, the iTunes, etc., and YouTube itself too, they all use algorithms to determine like which podcasts get seen. And that's why, like, when you're listening to a podcast, someone's always like, we want you to review it, we want you to like it, or whatever system is in place, because that will help to get seen. And it's just really hard to get from the whole morass of everyone posting podcasts. It's so hard to get to that point where like someone's just going to discover you, to the point where I would say it's probably not going to happen that way. You're not just going to like put the podcast on a place and get seen and it's going to grow organically. You have to put in that extra legwork to make that happen. And ideally, in a lot of situations, it's because you already have some kind of community in place. Like we at VOK were very fortunate to have like a community in place that was especially helped by the fact that Amin and the podcast of Ice and Fire had a huge listening community and was able to kind of promote it and get it to become something through that. But yeah, like having something in place is sort of essential, I would say, to growing. Like maybe you can get really lucky. Maybe like just the right amount of people find it and it becomes that snowball and you grow. But otherwise, you need something there. And I think something I've seen be very successful to that end, especially in the Game of Thrones, the Song of Ice and Fire community, is that a lot of the people who have been able to build really successful podcasts in that space did so because they already had an established social media presence. So in that case, there's a huge Twitter community for that. So a lot of the people there, before they ever made podcasts, their content was their Twitter. It was just the things they tweeted, and that allowed them to build a huge audience that they could then, when they decided, I want to create this other form of content, lead those people to that. So if your goal especially is to establish your podcast or just your brand or whatever on social media, you need to actually just be making social media content that's just for that place. Like, because most people who go to those places, that go to whatever, Instagram, TikTok, like Twitter, any of that stuff, they don't go to find podcasts. They go for the content that's on the place. And if they get to know that and get to love you for that, they will look for your other stuff. So that's one really, really good strategy, I think. In terms of just quickly on paid promotion, I would just say on this, like I just have some experience with this with work stuff. I would say this is like, don't go in. I would just like, as a rule, don't go into paid promotion thinking like, all right, if I spend a ton of money on this, I will get an audience, because it just does not work like that. You can get like a lot of likes, you can get a lot of interactions, but if that doesn't lead to listens, it doesn't mean anything really. And it often won't, unless you get really lucky or you have a really good sense of how to use the tools available to you to target the exact people you want. And even then, they might click it, they might not listen. There's a lot of steps in the process of actually getting people to come on board and view the thing you're doing. So it's not like, again, I would just say like, I wouldn't go out with the plan of I have this budget to spend on promotion for social media or any other way and say like that's going to get the job done.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is where it can get a little depressing, I think, because as with any art thing, you're ultimately what you're asking people is not listen to my podcast, read my book, watch my movie. It's use the time you have on this earth and dedicate it to what I did. And that is a big ask. It doesn't feel like as big an ask, but I think we're all coming to realize how big it is with how much content is out there. So I think, yeah, relationships are key. It takes a long time. Like, just to use like History of Westeros, for example, they're huge. They're a huge podcast. They have professional ad revenue, and they've been around for a really long time. And that was partly because they had a huge back catalog of episodes that were available when people decided that they wanted to listen to them. They were just producing that content without Patreon. I don't think Patreon existed for a long time, after they got started. I did a podcast that I personally thought could not have possibly been more timely. Like I did a scripted fictional Mets podcast, New York Mets podcast, that was imagining what the 2020 baseball season would have been when it was canceled because of COVID. And they were super short episodes. They were 2 or 3 minutes edited down, also took a long time to edit down. Snappy, did not require a lot of time or attention or whatever. I was trying to do my hardest on social media. I was tweeting it all the time. I was sharing it, everywhere I could think of. And it got almost no listens. And, we continued to do it, and we did it, for the length of the time that we had decided we were going to do it. And maybe if we had continued doing that through, this year and next year, like we would have gotten, a bigger audience. But the fact is, like, you can't rely on that stuff. That cannot be short of the internet gods always pick someone, right? Like they might pick you, but they probably won't. So like you have to do your work, your long, difficult, enduring work to make it to that place where people are willing to sacrifice the time they have on earth to give to you.
I find that incorporating comments from your listener base can also help grow it, and it's a good way to build out a community. But did you have something to add?
I'm such a simp for that. Like I do a million podcasts, right? I've done podcasts for years, and I will still like tweet at a podcast and like, oh my god, they read my comment. Like what the heck?
They said my name. One thing I just wanted to quickly add was Zach mentioned earlier guest hosting on other podcasts. I think that's a really good way of broadening your audience. If you can host on another podcast in your sort of fandom group, for example, someone else on Twitter who's into the Song of Ice and Fire community, if you can go on their podcast and you can have them on your podcast, that can broaden your audience because their listeners are going to come and hear them on yours and vice versa. And that's just a good way to make other people aware of it, make other people who might be interested in aware of it. And that's just a good cross-pollination kind of technique.
Yeah, just to give a quick anecdote on that, the only reason that I found the podcast of Ice and Fire and like Amin and all that was because he was a guest on another podcast. That was the only reason that I like.
Which podcast was it?
It was Boiled Leather because was like I was reading like Tower of the Hand and stuff, so that could do that.
Okay, well, I have. I think that's about it. Is there anything else? I'll ask one question, and then at the same time, you can, if there's anything else you want to touch upon, you can answer. Is because it kind of comes up from here because we talked about incorporating feedback. But what about like negative feedback and stuff? How do you handle that? Because it's the internet. There's a lot there. How do you handle negative feedback? And then anything else you want to mention just briefly about podcasting if we missed it?
I mean, on the one hand, I want to say if you're getting feedback, good, then you know that people are listening. But on the other hand, like if you're getting vitriolic, like it's the internet, it could be anything. Then I'm not sure. Like the standard, if it's bad comments, if it's hurtful comments, then if it's on something like Twitter, Instagram, etc., block and move on would be my suggestion. As somebody who has not experienced that. But I think this actually relates to what I was going to say for things to just cover in general, which is something that Zach touched on at the beginning of the podcast, or beginning of the panel.
This is like a podcast, though, because
it is.
it's a video cast essentially. I mean, but even panels become like podcasts if you take that same approach. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing that I was going to say was that whatever you're doing has to be motivated by you want to do it. It can't be because you want to have like 1 million listeners or make a bunch of money, because it probably won't happen. And similarly, if you're getting bad comments, like then you then it comes back to your personal motivation, which is why am I doing the podcast? That could be I'm learning how to make really cool audio drama. I'm learning how to work with a bunch of people. I'm making something cool that I've always wanted to see in the world but haven't seen. And in that case, it becomes easier to dismiss those comments because you're like, that doesn't affect my motivation. If your motivation is to get a bunch of listeners, then you're like, oh crap, what could I do better? What was the thing that they hated? And then you're focused on the wrong part of the problem.
Yeah, unconstructive or vitriolic comments are pretty easy to spot and ignore. But there have been constructive feedback regarding audio quality, regarding sort of host behavior. Talking over each other has been a problem in the past just because we've had issues with lag because there's people all over the world, and often podcasts can be quite big with 5, 6, 7, 8 hosts at a time. So we have had problems with with that in the past, and we've talked about it as curators and tried to figure out solutions. We've sort of put together sort of like etiquette guides, like here are some good tips on how to podcast. Here's some good tips on how to have a conversation. Let people finish their thought. Don't interrupt them. Don't talk at the same time because that's not enjoyable for the listener. If you notice you're talking too much, maybe just hang back, let someone else have a go at talking. If the host notices someone's being quiet, invite them to talk a little bit. Just trying to make it fair and diverse and all-inclusive. Yeah, I mean, technical things are pretty easy to solve generally. But yeah, in those situations, either we'll just put out those kind of guides, or if it's one person in particular where we've noticed a problem, we might just have a private conversation with that, and it can usually be solved like that.
Yeah, just to follow from what Nick said, I think that if you're in that space where you're either getting no feedback or getting negative feedback, I think it is valuable to remember to have that affirmation of like why you're doing this that comes just from you, that reason that is motivating you. It's like a talisman, I guess, like against the darkness of all the bad things that can happen or just the disappointments that can happen along the way, that like, yes, I am gaining X or Y thing from doing this no matter what, no matter how successful or unsuccessful it is on these other metrical levels. But yeah, in terms of negative feedback, I think there's like a lot of, tips out there about how to handle this kind of stuff. And for me, it's never going to become easy. Like, I just think that it's just painful to put yourself out there, like put something that you work hard on and put it out in the world. It's going to hurt, especially when people have negative comments. And even if it's constructive, it's still probably going to sting a little bit. Like, you can go back to the drawing board and fix it, know that you're going to be better next time, but it's just going to hurt. Like, I wish there was like a really good method for that not happening. And of course, like there are tricks and tips and things you can do. Like, you can just block them right away. You can just try to build like that personal armor, like I was saying, or whatever. But it's part of the thing. Like, it's just, this kind of stuff it's going to have its pains along the way. I think that's the experience, for better or worse.
Yeah, it's hard. I don't think there is a magic bullet for this, but I think one of the benefits of working in this for a long time is that it's not necessarily that you have like a thicker skin or whatever, but what you will have is a body of work. And like, I just like literally saw like a stupid iTunes review on one of my podcasts that were like, they're so negative, they're blah blah blah, and I'm like, oh, that really hurt. I guess we were negative about this. And then I was like, yeah, but we've covered stuff that we've raved about, and like weren't negative because we wanted to be negative. We had thoughtful criticisms of the thing that we were discussing, and if you don't have to agree, but like that's how we felt. And so I think having a body of work does allow you to kind of have a little perspective on that. Perspective is honestly the only thing that helps me at all, because I will believe anything mean that anyone says about me because they're obviously right. Yeah, so you have to take a longer view, and you have to take a wider view of the things that you've accomplished that person probably hasn't. Just about the miscellaneous, because
sure.
I'm just gonna
We're missing something. Yeah.
what Nick said, because
Sure.
this is just a drum that I will beat forever, which is that the only reason to do a podcast is because you want to do that podcast. you do not do a podcast if you want to make money. Do not do a podcast if you want to get free stuff or become famous or have famous people on your podcast or have a lot of listeners, because there is negative guarantee that that's going to happen. And even if your podcast is great, like it is just, we literally are in an ocean of content, and I'm sure that there is stuff out there that I would love that I will simply just not find, or see and be like, that's really cool. Don't have time for it, and the most polished professional whatever show is no guarantee of anything. The only thing you can control is how much fun you have doing this stuff. And that is, in my opinion, the only, if you are the only listener to your podcast, that should be, I know this is idealistic, but that should be enough. So yes, that is my rant.
Okay, so thank you to all our panelists today for the Podcasting 101 panel at Comic-Con at Home 2021. Is there any websites or social media you want to promote for your podcast or yourself?
Sure. I'm going to sneak in a tip while we're here. Try to get the same name on as many networks as possible, because then it's very easy to remember everything. So for example, pretty much everything that I do, with the exception of exactly one thing, you can find at the Nickscast. That's thenickscast.com, twitter.com/thenickscast, Facebook, Instagram. Those are the only things that we're on. So that includes the Zeal Archives, Fanthropological, and another podcast that I'm not involved with, but some of the other co-hosts that I work on do when there is Doctor Who on the air, called Who in Review. The other thing that I do is called The Race Against Time. It is an annual charity live streaming marathon on Twitch at twitch.tv/TheRaceAgainstTime. This year we are raising money for Trans Lifeline, which is a hotline for trans people in crisis. Actually, it's just for trans people in general. It is a really cool service. And you can find more information about that. Sorry, we play through Chrono Trigger and get all its endings, give away prizes, and raise money. And that you can find more information about at raceagainsttime.io.
I need to play Chrono Trigger. I started it as a kid, but I never finished it. And it was really fun, but for some reason I just lost the cartridge or something.
I could talk about it at some length, but we are at the end of this.
It's good motivation. Maybe I should play it and then I can listen to your podcast. You can subscribe to Vassals of Kingsgrave on iTunes, Stitcher, any of your preferred podcasting app. We've also got a YouTube channel where we post most of our content, Vassals of Kingsgrave on YouTube. Our WordPress page is vokpodcast.com. If you go there, you can find all of our content, including a link to our Discord if you want to join our community. And that's the best way to hang out with us and join a podcast. You can either join a podcast that we pitch, or you can pitch your own podcast. We're very inclusive and welcoming for new podcasters, so please come along and join the community. We'd love to have you. I have my own content online. I usually go by the moniker Valkyrist, Valkyrist. I've got a YouTube channel where I post like video essays, readings of different books and poems and things like that. And I write essays for Tower of the Hand occasionally, so you can follow me on Valkyrist. And that's about it.
I'll just echo all the VOK stuff that Duncan said, and beyond that, I don't have any personal shout-outs. I'll just say that please check out all the cool stuff that all these other people on this panel do, because whether I've seen or not seen it, I am absolutely sure it's awesome. I'm probably going to go check out Nick's Chrono Trigger streams after this because I love that game. So that sounds really fun. But yeah, that's it for me. This was a ton of fun. Thanks for having me on. I love talking about this kind of stuff. Like, I think about these kind of things a lot. So I'm very thankful to have a chance to do that.
And personally, I'm on Twitter at InkAzarine. You can find my podcasts, the Nice Jewish Fangirls podcast, the Podcast of Surprise, where we discuss the Witcher book series and theoretically the show when it comes back, the Level 7 Access podcast, which has sort of become a Disney Plus show, because that has everything. Yeah, that's pretty much where I am and what I'm doing. And of course, Vassals of Kingsgrave.
Great. Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks all.